The Threxian cartel did not annex Earth. They enrolled it. There is a difference, the enrollment packet insisted, in 11 languages and one apologetic footnote. Annexation implies resistance, and resistance implies humanity had ever stood a chance of refusing. Enrollment was gentler. Enrollment came with paperwork. Page 1 of that paperwork explained the proving. Every species new to the cartel's hierarchy would submit its flagship captain to a ritual duel against a warden, a cartel champion, before any trade terms could be finalized. This was not punishment. The packet was very clear on that point twice. It was orientation. The vessel assigned to humanity's proving arrived on a cargo hauler with a designation stenciled across its hull in flaking gray paint. Training unit class obsolete, retained for ceremonial use only. Someone in Threxian procurement had crossed out an earlier line, scheduled for disposal, and stamped reassigned. Client species trial over it in blue ink, as if the ship had been saved from a landfill and should be grateful. It had 31 years of dust in its ducting, and a command console that looked like something from a submarine museum. One chair, one set of manual controls, weapons and shields and engines all wired into the same panel. A Threxian engineer had attached a note in the delivery manifest, translated with what could only be described as pity. We regret the primitive interface. This model predates our species' cognitive specialization protocols and cannot be modernized within your timeline. We trust your captain will find workarounds. Warden Prime Keseth Vale arrived 4 days later to formally open the ceremony, and he smiled the entire time. His English was flawless, his consonants rounded in a way that suggested decades of study rather than translation software, and he shook hands with the diplomatic delegation in the correct order of protocol seniority without being told who outranked whom. "You should understand," he said in the observation lounge, looking out at the Corvette hanging in the docking cradle like something apologizing for its own existence, "that no client species has won a proving in 140 cycles. This is not a threat, it is a kindness. Species who understand their position early suffer less friction later." He paused, and the pause had the practiced warmth of someone who had delivered this exact reassurance many times before. "We have chosen the training vessel deliberately, a single-operator console. No specialization required. We did not wish to embarrass you with a ship you could not crew." There was a silence in the room that lasted exactly as long as it took the delegation to understand they had been told, politely, that they were being given the easy ship because a difficult one would be cruel. One person in the room was not looking at Keseth Vale. She was looking at the console schematics on the delegation's tablet, at the single chair, at the unified panel, and she had stopped listening somewhere around cognitive specialization protocols. Elena Voss had spent 11 years designing weapons targeting systems for vessels that were never meant to be flown by one person. She had been passed over for command twice, both times for officers with better posture and worse instincts, and she had accepted the Corvette assignment because nobody else wanted a ship the cartel had already called obsolete. She said the thing that mattered on the shuttle ride back from the observation lounge, almost to herself, reading the delivery manifest a second time. "They think this is a disability." Her aide asked what she meant. "One console, one operator. Weapons, shields, engines, all on the same board." She turned the tablet so he could see it. "They didn't give us the easy ship. They gave us the only ship a human could actually fly." The refit took 19 days, and the discoveries came in the order the ship allowed them to. Dr. Idris Os found the first one 3 days in, sitting cross-legged on the deck plating with the access panel open beside him and a diagnostic light throwing green shadows across his face. He had been ignored for 6 years at the Lagos Institute for arguing that unified operator interfaces were viable for combat vessels above Corvette class. Every review board had called the proposal a cognitive load fantasy, physically impossible for a single mind to track. He read the Corvette's control architecture twice before he said anything. "It's not a limitation," he said finally, to no one in particular. "It's a design philosophy. Somebody built this ship, assuming the pilot could hold weapons, shields, and navigation as one continuous decision, instead of 3 separate ones handed between people." He looked up. The Threxians didn't retire this because it doesn't work. They retired it because it stopped working for them. Their brains don't do continuous. They do segmented. This ship needed a mind that doesn't switch tasks. It needed a generalist. Chief Engineer Deho Lim found the second discovery in the reactor bay, 4 days after that, and he did not sit down so much as stop moving entirely, one hand still on the coupling he had been about to test. This reactor has a 40% margin above its rated output, he said, and it's been running at 50% of that margin for 3 decades because nobody flying it could safely manage propulsion and weapons draw at the same time without burning out a secondary crew member's attention span. He tapped the housing. We don't have that problem. One person can watch a power curve and a targeting reticle simultaneously. We can run this thing at full margin and never notice the strain because we were never asking 2 different people to notice it together. Lieutenant Priya Nair's discovery took the longest, and it was the one that mattered most. She had been the department's least popular officer for 2 years, ever since she filed a report arguing that cartel pattern targeting arrays had a built-in vulnerability nobody upstream wanted to hear about. Because the report implied the cartel's own combat doctrine was fragile by design, and everyone above her had cited career risk in declining to forward it. She spent 6 days inside the Corvette's weapons subroutines before she called Voss down to the bay, and when Voss arrived, Nair didn't stand up from the console. She just pointed at a line of latency data on the screen and said, "Every Threxian warship logs a handoff delay. 0.8 of a second, every single time control passes from the shield operator to the weapons operator to the helm. It's baked into their command structure, 1 specialist per system, 1 handoff between them every time the situation changes." She let that sit for a second. "We don't have a handoff, we have 1 person. 0.8 seconds every exchange forever. That's not a small gap in a duel that's decided in minutes." The cartel moved the proving up to 51 hours after a Threxian liaison officer filed a report of his own, 1 line, forwarded without comment, noting that the human crew was studying the training vessel with what he called inappropriate technical enthusiasm for a ceremonial obligation. Warden Prime Kessuthvale's office sent the revised schedule the following morning, in the same polished, unhurried language as everything else the cartel wrote. The kind of formal courtesy that took 3 sentences to say we noticed, and we did not like it. Voss read the notice standing in the reactor bay, and she did not slow down. She sent the crew back to their stations and moved the final systems checkup by 20 hours, and when Osai asked if 51 hours was enough, she said, "It's enough for what we actually need, which is 1 console and 3 people who already know what it does." The proving began the moment the countdown reached 0, and it did not last long. Kessuthvale's cruiser was faster on paper, better armed on paper, and crewed by 4 specialists, each managing exactly 1 system, each waiting the same 0.8 seconds for control to pass down the chain before they could respond to whatever Voss did next. She did not give them time to use it. She ran shields and weapons and helm as 1 motion, feinting a starboard turn that pulled the cruiser's shield operator to reinforce a flank that was never going to take fire, then cutting thrust, and rolling the Corvette under the cruiser's belly while its weapons operator was still 2 commands behind in the queue. 6 minutes and 40 seconds. That was the whole duel. Kessuthvale's crew adapted once, correctly, collapsing their formation into a tighter defensive pattern that should have closed the gap Voss was exploiting. For 11 seconds it worked, and the Corvette took a glancing hit across its aft shield that dropped output to 60%. Then the handoff delay reasserted itself, because it always would, because it was built into the ship and not the moment, and Voss put 2 shots through the gap the delay left open and disabled the cruiser's forward array. She let it go after that. She did not finish it. There was no rule requiring mercy in approving, and she gave it anyway because a dual humanity won by refusing to escalate said something the cartel would have to sit with longer than a wreck would. The official transmission came within the hour, formal and bureaucratically immaculate, congratulating humanity on an unanticipated tactical variance, and confirming that trade negotiations would proceed as scheduled. Voss read it once and set it aside. The second transmission came 4 hours later, unlisted, addressed to her directly, and it opened with 11 seconds of silence before Kessuthvale spoke. "I have reviewed the engagement 11 times, he said, and his English had lost the polish it carried in the observation lounge, gone plainer, closer to something unrehearsed. I assumed a species that specializes would always defeat a species that does not, because specialization is what allowed us to become what we are. I did not consider that specialization requires a handoff, and a handoff requires time, and time is the only resource a proving does not forgive." Another pause. It was audacious. I do not think we accounted for a captain who simply refused to be more than one person doing one job. I was wrong about what that would cost us. Voss did not answer that message that night. She spent the evening instead with Osai and Nair, drafting the terms she intended to bring to the trade negotiation the following week. Not just the standard access terms every enrolled species received, but a formal exemption from the cartel's mandatory specialization doctrine for human-crewed vessels. And beneath it, a trade proposal for the targeting array architecture the cartel had never thought worth defending, because they had never imagined anyone would want it. She was still annotating the reactor margin data past midnight, checking Lim's numbers against a second corvette the cartel had, almost as an afterthought, offered as compensation for the fight. Osai asked her eventually if she was going to sleep. "In a minute," she said, not looking up. "I want to see how far this margin goes before someone else decides what my next ship can and can't do."